Welcome to Infinite Business Dynamics. Today, we're jumping right into an explainer on the absolutely fascinating evolutionary history of Scrum. We're going to be looking at a massive paradigm shift that quite literally completely changed the way modern products are built. So today, we're tracing this huge evolutionary leap from the kind of sluggish relay race projects of the past to the agile, rugby-inspired frameworks that pretty much built the modern world. We're going to cover why this story matters, map out the historical roadmap, take a look at the world before Scrum, contrast that old relay race with a rugby match, break down the 6 characteristics of the rugby model, and then finally reflect on what all of this means for the future. Let's dive in. Okay, opening up chapter 1. Let's uncover exactly why understanding the past is so absolutely essential for managing today's complex projects.
Our journey today takes us all the way from understanding the massive failures of sequential product development back in the early 1980s, straight through to how Jeff Sutherland translated those early philosophical ideas into the very first practical implementation of Scrum. We're going to track the real-world impact of shifting from that rigid relay race mentality to a much more holistic rugby model. Because honestly, understanding exactly where Scrum came from gives us a profound understanding of why it works so incredibly well today.
Now, you might be wondering, why do we actually care about a history lesson? Well, the stakes for mastering this are incredibly high right now. Whether you're navigating immense market complexity, trying to ensure rapid value delivery, early, often, and continuously, or you're focused on building enterprise agility, these practices just aren't a luxury anymore. They are a sheer competitive advantage. Organizations out there are absolutely desperate to build this agility so they can adapt and thrive in a world that just doesn't stop changing. And hey, on a totally practical level, if you're aiming for PMP success, knowing Scrum's roots gives you the ultimate clarity to nail those situational questions. There's a great concept here, which is that by deeply understanding Scrum's roots, we get the clarity we need to adapt and thrive. This isn't just about reciting history, it's about giving you a sharp lens to make much better decisions right now, in the present. All right. Let's move on to our historical roadmap and see how all of this built from a mere concept into a massive global framework. Notice the really clear trajectory here. We start with Takeuchi and Nonaka's holistic approach and move all the way to a concrete software implementation. So let's go back to 1986. These two researchers introduced what they called the rugby paradigm in the Harvard Business Review. They looked around and realized that the sequential, siloed development of the era was just completely failing under the weight of modern complexity and constantly changing requirements. Their rugby model introduced real teamwork, overlapping phases, and continuous learning. Then leap forward to 1993. Jeff Sutherland takes these exact rugby principles and applies them to actual real-world software development projects. And finally, in 1995, we get the official birth of Scrum, presented formally by Sutherland and Ken Schwaber at the OPSLA conference down in Austin, Texas. Just think about that timeline for a second. In less than a decade, we see a massive evolution. We go from a compelling theory in a 1986 Harvard Business Review to a daring organizational experiment in '93, all the way to a global phenomenon by 1995. It goes to show you that the best way to predict the future of product development is to actually understand how it evolved in the first place. But to truly appreciate this evolution, we have to look back at the massive systemic failures of the pre-Scrum world. We need to understand what was so fundamentally broken. The pre-Scrum world was honestly a pretty grim reality of sequential bottlenecks. You'd have requirements passed to design, which trickled down to build, then test, then deploy. And the feedback? It came entirely too late. The result was agonizingly long lead times. We're talking projects that took months, sometimes even years, to deliver. Departments worked as isolated, siloed teams with terrible communication. And because feedback happens so late in the game, quality issues just piled up, making rework insanely expensive and risky. Worst of all, it led to cripplingly low adaptability. You simply couldn't respond to changing requirements, and that meant missing out on massive opportunities. Relying on that kind of sequential thinking, where you just focus on output rather than actual outcomes, left traditional models totally unable to manage rapid complexity. Work was done in these rigid phases, one right after the other. And success was stubbornly measured by just checking off tasks and producing big stacks of documentation rather than, delivering actual working software or real customer value. That old world was built for a completely different era, one that was stable, predictable, and way less connected. But then the 1980s ushered in these highly volatile markets, and suddenly that sluggish pacing meant sudden death for a product. Markets became entirely unpredictable, and those traditional models just could not adapt fast enough. The sheer devastation caused by these functional silos really can't be overstated. We are talking about hemorrhaging budgets, catastrophic drops in market share, and deeply, deeply frustrated developers who were just forced to work in broken systems. They desperately needed a new approach, one that actually embraced teamwork, adaptability, and continuous learning. So, it was obvious a revolution was needed. Let's look at the paradigm-shifting metaphor that literally changed everything. The real breakthrough was a shift in sports metaphors. Instead of this rigid, sequential relay race, they introduced an iterative, collaborative rugby model where the team moves down the field as a single, unified unit. Think about a relay race. Work is passed blindly from one function to another. Each team optimizes only its specific part, just doing things right within their own little silo. But critical context and information inevitably get dropped in those handoffs. The holistic rugby model completely changes that. Cross-functional teams work together from the very start. There's a continuous flow of information, problems surface early, and adaptability is baked right into the process. Let's just contrast these approaches head-to-head. The old relay race way was strictly about sequential handoffs, working in silos, optimizing individual parts, enduring super late feedback, and suffering slow, unpredictable results. The new rugby way? It's iterative. It completely relies on continuous collaboration within cross-functional teams. Instead of just trying to optimize the parts, you optimize the whole. The feedback is early and it's frequent, making the whole process incredibly fast and predictable. A relay race is all about the speed between individual runners, but rugby is about making progress together as a unified team. Okay, let's break down the specific DNA that makes this model function so beautifully. It's a great metaphor, sure, but there are highly concrete principles at play here. Takeuchi and Nonaka identified 6 core characteristics, but here is the absolute secret to this. They work together as a complete system, not just a menu of independent practices you can pick and choose from. If you remove even one of them, the power of the model is severely weakened. These characteristics became the absolute foundation, the very DNA of what we now call Scrum. Unpacking these 6 steps, we see a massive shift in how work gets done. First up, teams embrace built-in instability. They accept that environments are fundamentally unpredictable, and they prepare themselves to thrive in that constant change. To handle that chaos, they rely on self-organizing teams. These teams are empowered to make snap decisions and organize their own work. They aren't just sitting around waiting for orders from the top. And rather than wait for the previous step to perfectly finish, they use overlapping development phases. Multiple activities happen in parallel, which drastically increases their responsiveness. Throughout all of this, multi-learning is happening continuously across the individual, the team, and the organizational levels. All of this is guided by what they called subtle control, where leaders provide really clear direction and boundaries, giving teams total freedom without constraining them. And finally, organizational transfer of learning ensures that insights gained from one project are captured and spread everywhere, making the whole enterprise smarter over time. As we bring this explainer to a close, let's reflect on the incredible legacy born from these 6 characteristics and look forward to how they continue to shape the world we work in. Honestly, if you take nothing else away from this history, remember this. A new way of seeing created a completely new way of thinking. It showed us that prioritizing people over process, collaborative teams over rigid rules, produces absolutely great outcomes. It proved that iterating in short cycles with constant feedback creates immense value. Treating learning as a superpower turns raw experience into real organizational intelligence. Ultimately, simplicity wins. Simple rules and an empirical process yield extraordinary results. Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber took these insights and turned them into a legacy that is used by millions of people today to create value globally. So I'll leave you with this question to chew on. How can you apply this new way of seeing to transition your own team from a rigid relay race to an adaptable, collaborative rugby squad today? Remember, great frameworks don't start with complex rules, they start with a better way of seeing the world. Keep that in mind before our next explainer, where we're going to dive even deeper into the modern Scrum Guide. Thanks so much for joining me on Infinite Business Dynamics. To survive in modern business, you have to move fast. Markets are volatile, technology evolves overnight, and the ability to adapt and deliver value quickly is the only way to stay ahead of the competition. But the corporate environments many of us still work in weren't designed for this kind of speed. They were built for the early 1980s, an era when markets were highly predictable and change was slow. Back then, most companies managed product development like a strictly sequential relay race. Look at this workspace from the 1980s.
Before Agile, corporate work followed a rigid structure. Individuals isolated at their terminals, executing repetitive tasks. Back then, most organizations managed product development like a relay race. Work moved down a strict linear timeline. One team handled the concept, passed the baton to design, who handed it off to development, then testing, and finally launch. That linear model functioned well for decades. It was optimized for a stable industrial economy, where customer demands rarely shifted and technology moved at a predictable pace. In that environment, success meant putting your head down, doing your exact part perfectly, and passing it over the wall to the next person. But that system was built for a business landscape that was about to disappear. By the late 1980s, global markets accelerated, consumer expectations rose, technology began to network globally, and the sheer complexity of doing business spiked. This graphic shows the model fracturing. In functional silos, isolated departments caused delays and lost shared ownership. The fatal flaw is inability to manage complexity. With feedback arriving only at the finish line, adjusting to changing requirements becomes incredibly expensive. The system failed because the underlying model couldn't process chaos. Survival required a different approach to navigating complexity. This historical roadmap shows where that new approach originated. In 1986, researchers Hirotaka, Takeuchi, and Ikujiro Nonaka published a paper in the Harvard Business Review, proposing a radical alternative to the standard assembly line. This diagram illustrates their core observation. Instead of a relay race, they looked at the holistic movement of a rugby team. Concept, design, develop, test, and launch are no longer isolated steps. They happen in an interconnected loop, executed by a cross-functional team moving together. This observation shifted the objective of product development. The goal was no longer to maximize the speed of one isolated runner, but to maintain collective adaptability and make progress as a single, unified whole. This circular diagram outlines the model's 6 characteristics. Built-in instability accepts dynamic change. Self-organizing teams make independent decisions. Overlapping phases execute work in parallel. Multi-learning continuously captures knowledge. Subtle control sets boundaries instead of rigid commands. Finally, organizational transfer of learning scales insights company-wide. These 6 pillars function as a mechanical system. If you remove even one characteristic, the team's defense against complexity breaks down. For a few years, this rugby philosophy remained in academic theory. But by the early 1990s, the software industry was buckling under traditional project management, forcing people to try something different. In this office, we see a cross-functional group collaborating closely around a single problem. This timeline tracks that transition. Between 1993 and 1995, pioneers Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber translated those rugby principles into practical rules for organizational teams. Their work culminated in 1995 at the OOPSLA Software Conference, formally presenting the Scrum development process, marking its official birth. What started as an observation of a sports team had been engineered into a robust industrial framework, one capable of impacting the global economy. The conditions that birthed Scrum have only compounded since. Today's business landscape is a hyper-connected web of data, instant feedback loops, and constant volatility. Yet mastering this environment still requires the logic Takeuchi and Nonaka observed decades ago. Success depends on prioritizing human collaboration over rigid processes and rapid iteration over long-term assumptions. As this graphic outlines at the bottom, understanding this history provides the clarity professionals need to navigate enterprise agility and maintain a competitive advantage. Effective frameworks provide a new logic for seeing the world, making the rules themselves feel intuitive.
Today's journey has taken us back to where Scrum began, not as a software framework, but as a revolutionary way of thinking about complex product development. From the pioneering work of Hirotaka, Takeuchi, and Ikujiro Nonaka in 1986 to Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber's practical implementation in the mid-1990s, we've explored the origins of ideas that continue to shape agile delivery around the world. Every great framework has a beginning, and every evolution builds upon those first principles. The years between 1986 and 1995 laid the foundation for what Scrum would eventually become. In Episode 2, we'll continue that journey by exploring how Scrum evolved into the official Scrum Guide, how the Agile Manifesto and lean thinking influenced its development, and why intentional minimalism became one of its defining characteristics. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the evolution of Scrum.